All right, well, so welcome everyone. I'm Kate Schaefers and I'm director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Minnesota, and we are thrilled to host today's talk. I'd like to also welcome our friends to the West. We have members from OLLI at University of South Dakota. So Thea Ryan, thank you so much for partnering with us on this. And we'll be recording today's session and sharing it with both the OLLIs. I want to start with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It's important to acknowledge the peoples on whose lands we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. I also want to go over a few logistics. We have a big class today. We're thrilled with that. Please mute yourself right now while Rob is doing his presentation. We will open things up for a discussion later in the presentation. So go ahead and put your questions in chat if you like, and we'll also be looking at raised hands to get questions towards the end. So let me introduce our speaker today. Rob Miller is a seasoned entrepreneur with 4 startups and 3 co-founded ventures under his belt. His track record includes 4 exits, 1 at a unicorn valuation, primarily in regulated industries and tech. He's an active angel investor, helping startups realize their growth potential through lean startup principles. Based in Chicago, Rob is married with 3 children. He is instrument-rated private pilot, primarily flying rugged tailwheel airplanes in the backcountry. That could be a whole session in and of itself.
We could do another one on that. I'd love to.
And then Rob, he's also a University of Minnesota alum and with a bachelor's degree. So welcome. I'm going to turn it over to Rob, and we'll mute you if you're not muted. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Kate. I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you. I wanted to start this with a thought experiment. So think back to one particular day. It was Wednesday, January 29th, 2019. And the reason I picked this particular day is that was the coldest day in the Twin Cities in the last 20 years. So if you remember that day, the high was -14 and the low was -28. So I want you to think about what you did that day. Did you go outside? When you went outside, do you remember that sting of the cold? Do you remember that sudden notion that any spot of your body that wasn't covered by clothing was suddenly freezing cold? Do you remember the breath that came out of your mouth and the big cloud of steam and how it fogged up your glasses immediately? And do you remember the longer you stood out there? Do you remember that the cold started slowly seeping in so that every single moment got just a little bit colder and a little bit colder? And that you really needed to get inside and that you just couldn't, the human body couldn't withstand that. And those sensations, that tingling, that cold, that freezing. Now what I want you to do is imagine that, but now stay outside for 8 days straight. And I also, at the same time, I want you to walk to St. Cloud from the University of Minnesota campus. So if you're in the mindset of that freezing, bitter, bone-chilling cold and that long, slow 8-day walk to St. Cloud that's 60 nautical miles away from the University of Minnesota campus, keep that mindset as we go through this presentation, because I think you'll be perfectly set up to enjoy this discussion. So let me share my screen, and I want to talk to you about the expedition that I had the absolute pleasure of joining, the last 300 expedition in 2019. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, great. Thank you. So let's first, now that we're good and cold, let's start with a little bit of 8th grade geography about Antarctica. If you were like me, you kind of knew about Antarctica, you knew it existed, but you didn't really have a good sense of the scope and the scale of this place. But it's 14 million square miles. It's basically the continental United States plus Mexico put together. So it's a vast, vast place. It's interesting that it's about 60% of the Earth's fresh water. And this is accumulated ice that's accumulated over the course of millions of years. The ice is as much as 3 miles deep throughout the continent, which makes it an interesting place too, because not only is it a big ice shelf of fresh water, but it's also at the surface of the ice, it's about 9,000 feet of altitude. So you're talking about something that's almost twice the altitude of Denver. some incredibly very thin air and very, very dense cold. It's the coldest, driest continent. And it's also, interestingly, the least biologically diverse. Melinda and I were chatting before this about her upcoming expedition to the Antarctic Peninsula, where she'll actually get to see some wildlife. But there's very little flora or fauna in this continent at all. The situation of the tilt of the Earth means that Antarctica is either mostly in daylight or mostly in darkness. So during the summertime, it's 24/7 of daylight, and the opposite in the winter. And the sun will set, and it'll set for months at a time. The highest recorded temperature in Antarctica was, kind of no surprise, recorded recently, 64.9 degrees Fahrenheit out on the peninsula. It's the warmest it's ever been there. But the coldest it's ever been there is a minus 128. And as I talked about, the South Pole is about the same altitude as Breckenridge, Colorado. So more or less 10 times the altitude of Minneapolis. So as you're thinking about that moment of cold, that moment of like bitterness that happened when you walked around that Wednesday in 2019, and now think about it at an altitude where you really can't breathe. And now walk to St. Cloud, and you're starting to get a sense of kind of the experience of an Antarctic expedition. The continent is totally unique in the world in that no one owns it. There were territorial claims around the age of exploration and in that era, but by international treaty that was signed in 1959, no country owns Antarctica. The treaty prohibits any exploitation of minerals. It keeps the continent purely for science. There's total freedom of scientific research. No military activities, no weapons of any kind are permitted. The countries that operate there operate in international and sometimes national bases, but there's deep cooperation between all those bases. And as you'll see later on in the presentation, that cooperation is just required for survival. Nobody can survive Antarctica on their own. But this treaty, it's important to note, went in force in the 1960s, but it's up for discussion and renewal in 2041. So at some point in the very near future, in the future of our own lifetimes, the question will be in front of the world is, are we going to keep Antarctica for scientific and peaceful and as open wilderness, or are we going to exploit the minerals and resources and fresh water that exist in Antarctica? That's a choice that the world will have to make soon. You can't talk about exploration and expeditions in Antarctica without talking about the age of exploration. And probably the two greats of these eras, Amundsen and Scott. Both of whom were attempting to be the first expeditions to reach the South Pole around 1910, 1911, 1912. But both of them approached the project very differently. Scott, with the British stiff upper lip, believed that his men were courageous and could endure a lot of hardships, and that they could do things that were more difficult. So they brought along a huge amount of scientific equipment to do research. They were trying to pioneer the use of motorized sledges using gas-powered engines. And Scott believed that these Shetland ponies, these little ponies, were the best animal to help them pull their cargo through. But it wasn't much more than a few weeks into the expedition when they realized that these motor sledges would never work. The gasoline froze, the engines were seized up, that the ponies were totally ill-suited. So by the time the expedition was pretty far along, it was all the men themselves in the expedition who were pushing their sledges and carrying their materials by pushing these sleds, which led to just incredible exhaustion. Amundsen, on the other hand, was very efficient. His mission was just to get to the South Pole. They had the lightest equipment they could come up with at the time. They had sledges, and they pioneered the use of dogs, which now we think of as just customary. It's normal to use dogs in these types of polar, Arctic, and Antarctic expeditions. But Scott was really one of the pioneers of that. And he and his men, and it was all men in his expedition, made their way south, reaching the South Pole for the first time by any human on the December of 1911. And Amundsen had cached his supplies all the way along so that he and his men had supplies for the return trip. He set up a tent, left some supplies, because he knew that Scott was coming. And it was a race, but at that time they had no communications with each other. So Amundsen had no idea whether or not Scott had gotten there before he did. when he got to the pole, realized he hadn't. So he left a Norwegian flag in a very plucky measure, and he left a tent full of supplies for Scott and his men. About a month later, Scott and his men arrived, hugely disappointed to see the Norwegian flag at the South Pole. And with that disappointment, they turned back around and headed back toward the Ross ice shelf, back toward the end of the continent. But Scott, given that he gave up so much of his expedition's time and resources toward equipment, scientific equipment, toward these animals that weren't useful, toward these motorized sledges, he had far less food and hit far worse weather. Amundsen was able to get out ahead of the weather that Scott had to face. And ultimately, although Scott and his team reached the South Pole in 1912, no one survived from that expedition. Minnesota, too, has a fantastic polar exploration heritage. There are some really amazing Minnesotans that have pioneered things in the South Pole. And two of them I wanted to point out. Will Steger is one who now still lives in St. Louis County, Minnesota. Will has a number of firsts that he's accredited for. He's the first dog sled teams to make it to the North Pole. He led an expedition that was the first to cross the entire continent or the entire country of Greenland from north to south. And he was also one of the pioneers of trans-Antarctic trips. So he did the first dog sled trip, the Trans-Antarctic expedition, from one side of Antarctica to the South Pole through to the other. A fantastic guy, still lives in northern Minnesota and is a activist for the climate. The picture here is for a documentary about Will called After Antarctica, which I believe is on Netflix or Amazon, and it's fantastic. If you want to watch another, if I haven't scared you off of all things polar and Antarctica by the end of this presentation, definitely go seek out and watch After Antarctica. It's a fascinating discussion of Will. One of my favorites, though, is Ralph Plaisted. Ralph was, I think if I had a chance to meet him, he would have been a very, very cool guy. Ralph was an insurance salesman born in Bruno, Minnesota, up north. I'm not exactly sure where Bruno is, but was literally sitting around the bar with his buddies one night talking about these newfangled snowmobiles and all the things that they could do with snowmobiles. And I don't know, history doesn't record if it was a bar bet or how exactly they came up with the idea. But Ralph came up with, and his people came up with the idea of taking snowmobiles to the North Pole. And in 1968, the snowmobile was a brand new thing. So Ralph, being an insurance salesman, was a very persuasive guy. He persuaded Sea-Doo to donate snowmobiles, equipment, and all the necessary logistics for him and basically his beer buddies from northern Minnesota to take those snowmobiles and drive them to the North Pole. The first mission that he went on was a failure. The equipment broke down, people got too cold, they couldn't get through. But on their second expedition, Ralph and his team made it to the South Pole as the first group to ever do it on a snowmobile. And I love the story of Ralph. Sorry, let me click here. So this will now bring us to my friend, another one of the greats of polar exploration, Robert Swan. And Rob will introduce himself a little bit, and then he'll do a little bit more introduction of me.
Ladies and gentlemen, young people, this is Rob Swan, and I am the first person in history to have walked to the North and South Poles. And I want to introduce you today to Rob Miller, a great friend of mine, a man who is committed. When he says he's going to do something, you better believe it. He actually does stuff. And my mission in life is very simple. You can see on my shirt here, in the year 2041, the world, us, will decide on the future of Antarctica. Right now, we all own this place. No one owns it. And I believe we should leave this place alone as a natural reserve land for science and peace. Wouldn't it be great if we just left one place alone forever? Well, that's our mission. And Rob Miller believed in this enough, and you'll hear his story, to go literally to the heart of the Antarctic, one of the most hostile places on Earth, and make a journey on foot to the South Pole because he believed in this mission. It's a fantastic story because it's a regular person doing something absolutely extraordinary. I'm proud to be Rob's friend, and please, all of you, don't forget this. If you can do or dream you can, begin it now. For boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. Good luck to you all, and you'll really enjoy Rob's speech. Thank you very much.
Rob is a fantastic human being. He's written multiple books. As he said, he was the first person to walk to both poles. And since returning from his North Pole adventure, he was really recruited, or maybe drafted is a better word, by Jacques Cousteau, who was the first one to point out to him that this treaty will expire and that someone needs to take care of this continent. And that's the inspiration behind Rob's adventures. The picture up here in the upper right is Rob in the 1980s when he made it to the South Pole. Down here below that is him and his son Barney, who will appear later in our adventure when they were at the South Pole multiple years later. Rob is an amazing guy. So after having a chance to meet Rob, I was absolutely floored to be invited to join his last 300 expedition that he kicked off in 2019 to go to the South Pole. Rob was set to be the expedition leader. And then the expedition was also going to be co-led by an amazing person, Johanna Davidson. Johanna is a Swedish woman living in Finland who, at the time that she was leading our expedition, owned the record for solo unsupported female walk to the South Pole. So she walked to the South Pole from the coast in 38 days, 23 hours, you see here, and smashed the previous record by 10 hours. And she's just absolutely amazing. She's a nurse, and absolutely amazing and very understated person, and fantastic to be around, and kind of a legend when you're there around Antarctica with her. People like want to come up and get their pictures, their selfies with her. They want to get her autograph. She's an incredible, cool person. But the one thing I loved about her story of when she smashed the solo record is she spent one night at the South Pole. And then, because she had never done it before, she decided to kite sail back. So she didn't get on an airplane like the rest of us. She got out a kite sail and sailed with that along her skis and did the return trip in about 13 days on a kite sail. So Johanna is something else. She's an amazing person. So I had this great opportunity to join Rob's expedition. So why was he calling it the last 300? So years prior, Rob and his son Barney had set out to become the first team to cross Antarctica using all renewable energy. And that was called the South Pole Energy Challenge. So they were using renewable fuels. So they're like biofuels for their stoves, and the stoves are vitally important to these projects because you've got to be able to melt snow to live. And it's not for heat; it's for the water that you need to live. So they were given equipment from NASA NASA had designed for possible exploration of Mars to see if they could use non-powered resources to melt snow. They had biofuels, as I said, and they had solar power for their batteries. And they set off. And about 2 months into the expedition, Rob fell and broke his hip and then had to be evacuated. And at that point, I think Rob was about 62 years old when he broke his hip and was evacuated from the South Pole. Barney and the rest of the team went on to finish the South Pole Energy Challenge, but Rob was 300 miles short of the pole when he broke his hip. So the last 300 expedition was Rob's sort of revenge tour. He's like, I am undaunted. I'm going to finish this. Drop me off at 300 miles, the same place I broke my hip, and I will ski the rest of the way. The expedition was designed not just for Rob to finish his mission, but also to draw attention to this idea that the treaty, as Rob said, the treaty that protects Antarctica expires in 2041. And so a group of us joined for the last leg of the expedition. That the expedition was set up with a group of like Johanna and Rob and Barney and some others who were going to ski the last 300 miles. Then the rest of us in my team were going to join him for the last degree. The last degree is 89 degrees south to the South Pole. So 89 degrees south is that last ring of latitude before reaching the South Pole. And that is 60 nautical miles. So a group of a dozen of us were meant to team up with Rob, to meet up with Rob, rendezvous with him with Johanna, Katinka, and the Barney and the rest of the team at 300 miles, or sorry, at 60 nautical miles from the pole, and walk the last kind of the glory lap, if you will, with Rob in the expedition, so that Rob could finish his last 300 miles and complete his journey to the pole and help to draw attention to this expiring treaty. So that's the expedition that I was invited to. And it was the expedition itself was about 18 months in the planning. So I had plenty of time to get ready, but it was quite an arduous process. So this is a video from my first
Okay, in
moment
about
of training.
12 months, maybe 13, I'll be walking the last 60 nautical miles, that's 69 statute miles, to the South Pole, pulling a load on cross-country skis. Training starts today. Man, this sucks. Heartbeat already 153. I got this tire, I got this rig, and wow, it's gonna be an adventure, that's for sure.
So my almost 13 months of training really started on that day when I bought the rig that you see here in the picture, which is the rig the harness and backpack rig that I carried to the South Pole. I went to the local tire store and got 3 tires out of the recycling bin, went to the hardware store and hooked up some hardware to connect them all together in a little bit of a train, and started pulling them around my the town I lived in, Hinsdale, for about the next 13 months. The training was really arduous. It's the tire pulling and stuff was basically, between 1 to 2 hours a day, intermixed with running, intermixed with weight training. And then on the weekends, every Saturday and Sunday, I would usually have about a 4-hour mission. So about 3 hours of tire pulling through the forest preserves, through any kind of hilly terrain I could come up with, followed by usually 1 hour of running. And it was amazing to see, like not a super fit athletic kind of guy, but it was amazing to sort of see that with a good coach and a good training program, that the heart rate that I was talking about, where I was pulling a tire and at 150 beats per minute, over the course of the training, it really dropped down to where I was comfortably pulling a tire at about 120 beats per minute of heart rate, 110, 120 beats per minute. But it was arduous. The other part of the training that was happened a lot during the winter was uphill treadmill. So if you have a treadmill at home, one really great way to work out on it is just to put it up at its maximum setting and walk. So on some of the days, the training was 2 hours of just uphill treadmill walking. So at that time, I think I watched more movies than I'd ever possibly imagined. It was also a chance to do a total shakedown of gear. And I love gear, and you'll hear more about this later, but I tried just about every combination of hats, coats, mittens, gloves, base layers, shoes, backpacks. And you see here is actually a compass rig that a friend of mine's son 3D printed for me, because navigation and I'll talk about this in a bit more, but navigation in the South Pole, toward the South Pole, is all still very old-fashioned. Very old-fashioned, with just a map and a compass and a direction and walking in a straight line. So it was an arduous training program, but it was totally achievable with enough time and enough, heart to do it. Another key part of my training was that was a rule. It was based around a rule that no one is allowed to even be on the continent of Antarctica without previous Arctic or Antarctic training. So for me, that meant to go to Norway. And I went to a training camp run and operated by Katinka Gellenhammer, who's in this picture here. Katinka is, by her own rights, a very accomplished polar explorer. She's at times held multiple records for skiing fast across Norway. She and her daughter have mother-daughter records in those same races. And she's widely known as one of the today's real experts and go-to people on polar training. And so Katinka took me to some very rough country in Norway, north of Oslo. We spent some fairly miserable days in conditions like the picture on the right here, pulling sledges, training both in uphill and downhill, training on the skis, really just learning how to live in this kind of environment, learning how to build a fire with your stove, with your camp stove, how to cook, how to just do anything outside. The other thing that Norway was really important for me for was that the gear. And you'd think you can kind of buy anything on the internet, but it's not necessarily true. There's some very specialized polar equipment, like this jacket that I've been wearing. I took it off because it was a little bit hot. But there's this is a very thin, lightweight jacket. It's almost like kind of like a raincoat, but it's completely windproof. And it's designed for polar explorations. And we'll get into the reasons for that a little bit. But this kind of stuff isn't available here. You can't even buy it on the internet. So I got a complete set of kit in Norway, all guided by Katinka, who's an expert. So that was a really pivotal part of my training, because before that, I spent plenty of time hiking in the woods or being outside or skiing or whatever, cross-country skiing, but never had spent time really learning the ins and outs of living in that multiple freezing temperature type environment. So fast forward to the beginning of the expedition. My team and I met in Punta Arenas, Chile, which is, pretty much as far south as you can get in Chile and still have a major city. We gathered our equipment there and then boarded this airplane. This is an Russian cargo Aleutian plane that was flying the flag of Kyrgyzstan. So as an aviation guy myself, I wasn't super encouraged by the aviation regulatory measures in Kyrgyzstan, but it's basically the only ride to Antarctica. So we got on this airplane, this cargo airplane, and we're about a 5-hour flight to a completely ice runway at a camp just inland of Antarctica, where basically all of the expeditions like this are based from. So this picture is taken you can kind of see down the radar the runway of 10,000 feet of just pure ice that this airplane lands on. The inside of the airplane is, as you might imagine, what a Russian cargo plane looks like. It's pretty sparse. Certainly no flight attendant, certainly no peanuts or a movie. All of us in there. And the worst part about the whole experience was that the airplane itself is just blazing hot in there. It's probably 70, 80, 90 degrees. I don't remember. But the minute you step off the airplane, you're going to be on the ice runway in Antarctica. So you need to be dressed for that. So you're in your base layers, you're in your outer layers, you're in with all of your kit, your big, huge snow boots clomping around inside this airplane where it's 80 degrees. So you're dying of sweat, knowing that immediately you're going to be getting out of this airplane and dying of freezing. So it was quite an adventure just getting there inside this Russian cargo plane. And as an interesting aside, this cargo plane, because of the war now, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the maintenance for this airplane is impossible. So now they've switched it to a really apparently very, very nice 767. So I guess they missed out. Once we got to the ice runway and got to the inner part of Antarctica, we had a grave disappointment. It was fun to see Rob Swan, but why is Rob Swan here? He's supposed to be something close to 100 miles from the pole right now. We're supposed to rendezvous with him and meet him up, and so that we can take this last 60-mile glory lap with Rob. But now I look at this picture and I can kind of see the sadness on his face. About 5 days before we arrived, Rob fell again and broke his hip again and had to be evacuated. They pushed his hip back into place, and we saw him just the day before he was to leave the continent to go back to Chile for medical attention on his hip. Rob tells kind of a funny story around this, and I will never tell it as well as he does. But he was he was at base camp, and when he broke his hip, and it wasn't one of these glorious fell into a crevasse and was rescued by his son or anything quite that glorious. Literally, Rob was sitting on a 5-gallon bucket, doing his business, and fell. Lost his balance and fell off the 5-gallon bucket. A little bit of an ignominious end for a great polar explorer, right? But as Rob is lying there in pain with his hip out of socket, broken, trying to pull his trousers back up, trying to yell to the other guys through the wind to come help me, he sees a solo skier off in the distance. And he looks at it and he's like, I think that's Jesus coming to get me. I think I'm dead. And as he's sitting there lying in pain, and finally his son and the other expedition people come over and like, Rob, you're fine. Let's get you up. And they all stand there and watch as this solo skier goes by. And it turns out that solo skier was one of the many people that have tried to do the solo unsupported tour. And as a part of those records, if you're doing a solo unsupported expedition, you can't talk to anyone else. You can't interact with anyone else, or else it's not solo unsupported. So even though they don't even know if the skier had seen Rob fallen over there or not. Rob certainly saw him, but Rob thought he had literally met his maker at that moment, falling off of a 5-gallon bucket while doing his business in the middle of Antarctica. So it was a little bit of a heavy heart that we started our expedition knowing that Rob wasn't going to be our leader. But the show has to go on. And so we continued on and commenced our preparations for the last 300 expedition. When I said we landed at the ice runway, we landed here at this place called Union Glacier Camp, which is a seasonal camp set up by this OLLI company that is where it's the logistical hub of anything that's non-governmental that happens on Antarctica. So these private expeditions, scientific research organizations, different ones like, for example, if you've heard of the marathons that happen on 7 continents, the Antarctica Marathon happens here. And it's got to be the worst marathon ever because all they do is run circles around a 10K lap. Because when you're out here in this area, there are crevasses everywhere. So you can't just walk anywhere you want to go. So they have to go on this proven track. But as you can see, it's it's not a terrible place. It's sort of what makes for a hotel in Antarctica. Those tents were relatively nice. They were not heated, but it was decently warm inside your sleeping bag. And he had enough room to stand up, which was better than any other time I had during the expedition. So at Union Glacier Camp, we managed all the logistics for our expedition. We put together all our kit, got all our food, started planning what we would do by day, started shaking down our gear just to make sure. One of the tasks is to go out on this 10K loop where you spend a day just skiing around just to make sure everything was okay. But the worst mistake I made on the entire expedition happened on that 10K loop. Because me and my tent mate were both ex-military people, and we got along famously, and we were having a great chat the whole 10K skiing. And the more we chatted, the faster we skied. The faster we skied, the farther ahead of the group we got. So as we got back and the group came together, the group expedition leader came over and pulled us aside and said, "Okay, you guys, great job on that ski. Now you're carrying all the extra gear." So we had about 100 pounds of our own gear, more or less. And between the two of us, I think we carried another 75, 80 pounds of fuel, tents, other expedition gear. So lesson learned, never be that guy that goes too fast on the trial loop in the expedition. That picture is my friend Ian, one of my expedition mates, as he prepared his kit for the expedition. So once you're ready to go from leaving from the ice runway at Union Glacier Camp, you might be surprised to know that probably one of the best airplanes for flying around Antarctica is actually a 1940s DC-3. This airplane is very capable. It operates really well at high altitudes. It has short takeoff and landing. As you can see here, you can put skis on it and it'll operate really well. So there's a company up in Wisconsin that modifies these to put on modern turboprop engines, and you can kind of see that modern engine on there. And so here's a 1940s airplane that I'm getting in my 2019 self to ride another 4 hours from the Union Glacier Camp down to our drop-off point at 89 degrees south. One of the most sort of jaw-dropping moments of the expedition was when we got dropped off by that plane. Immediately you set up camp because it's cold there and you need some sort of shelter. Camp was set up, we were safe, everything was fine, and the airplane left. We're like, wait, we're alone here. There's no rescue now. We have to walk to the pole. If the weather's bad, the plane can't even come back and get you. You have to depend on everyone else on the expedition to do their job, to keep themselves awake, to keep themselves alert, to keep going on the expedition. Now we're on our own completely. We're mostly cut off from communication. You can get sat phone service there. But one of the biggest challenges in this environment of minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit is the cold, right? The batteries on your phone will die within 30 minutes. My iPhone, I would charge it up every night and it would be gone by the time I took the first picture. Same thing with satellite phones and everything else. So you are really alone on this expedition. So from that point, we started our walk. And now for 8 days, we're marching to the pole. And this is very much this is a shot of exactly what it looked like. And I'll give you a sense of the pace and the scenery and the equipment that we're carrying. And if you see the big backpack, that's me there in the middle. So there's a lot of interesting things to point out in this picture. First of all, the pace. So if you think about your walking pace, it's pretty fast, right? You're walking 2 to 3 miles an hour. But when you're pulling a load at 2 to 3 miles an hour, you're now sweating. And that sweat in Antarctica at minus 20 degrees cannot be evaporated. It will turn immediately into ice. And if you get sweat on your body that turns to ice, you will die of hypothermia. You can't survive that. So the key objective in these marches was not to walk too fast. You have to stay very, very slow. You have to control that sweat. You have to make sure that you're not expending too much energy and sweating. If you sweat, you die. These marches were set up so that we would march for 50 minutes, and then we would take a 10-minute break every 8 hours. So for 8 hours a day. So we'd spend 8 hours marching, we'd spend 8 hours sleeping, and we'd spend 8 hours in basically logistics, administration, gear, food, cooking, setup, breakdown of our tents. So you might think that the 50 minutes, you'd spend the whole time of that 50 minutes just thinking about that break. And that was true for the first 50 minutes that I ever skied out here. But then you get on that break and suddenly you realize, okay, I have to fix something on my ski. I'm hungry. I need to eat. I'm expending 10 or 12,000 calories a day here. I absolutely need to eat. Oh, by the way, I need to go to the bathroom. Oh, by the way, it's freaking cold out here. And you have 10 minutes. So now you start to, you first of all prioritize your food, because the food is what you need the fuel. But so you're on your body, you're carrying snacks. You're carrying like energy bars, you're carrying salami, cheese, for like dried fruit, any kind of snack that you really like that has a high caloric density. But the problem is at minus 20, everything is frozen. So now you're trying to like put an energy bar in your mouth, but that thing is frozen like an ice cube. The only place you can get it to warm up is inside your mouth. But now you're still breathing kind of hard because you're out of breath and it's at 9,000 feet. And now you've got this big chunk of frozen energy bar in your mouth, and you're trying to breathe out of the corner of your mouth. You're trying to chew on this thing. You've got 10 minutes. You don't want to choke. The breath is already very short. It's very, very cold. The minute you stop walking, you need to put on a warmer coat. You've now think about, I have to go to the bathroom. You have to run over to the side and do your business. And this is Antarctica, so it's leave no trace. So everything that you send out has to be carried back out. You have to take everything with you. You might have to adjust your gear, then you got to get back on your skis and get going again. These 10-minute breaks were the most awful experiences of the entire expedition, because they were just so packed and so panicky and so full of that, like, oh my gosh, how am I going to survive? How am I going to survive this 10 minutes? Let's just get back to walking. The kit that you see here, you can see how my harness work. You can see, and I'll talk about kit in a little bit, but this is a good place to illustrate. One of the innovations that I think came from the Norwegian explorers was that big blue thing that's on top of my sledge there. And what that is that's my sleeping equipment. So because the time outside is so difficult and so cold and at such high altitudes, the minute you stop walking, that cold starts to seep in, as I said. And so we really need to get inside. So you really need to build up your tent. You really need to get back inside so that you can survive. So instead of like, all of you have probably been on a camping trip and all the messing around with your sleeping bag and rolling it and unrolling it, inflating the air mattress, getting the mat and the sleeping mat all set. Well, what the Norwegians came up with is a little bag that just does all that. So you literally just throw that in your tent, unzip it, and crawl in. And so grab your bag out of the bottom of your sled that has your food and your others, like your change of socks and your other supplies. You throw that in and you're inside your tent. So it's an amazing little innovation that works great in polar exploration. I want to give you a flavor of what the camps are like. So every time we stopped for about 8 hours, we'd set up these little camps. We'd build these tents. Then you can see you pile snow around the tents. You have very specific requirement to stake in your tent. And the thing that's the strongest and the deepest stake that you can pour in the ground is actually your own skis. So your own skis are anchoring the tent. Your ski poles are out there. Everything has to be tied down. And you can see the sleds are all tied to the skis that are tied to the tents, because at night things will just blow away. So you have to keep everything there. You have to keep it all. And, fortunately for us, you had 24 hours of daylight. So it wasn't like fumbling around in the dark. Unfortunately for us, again, we're at 9,000 feet. So imagine kind of the out of breath you feel when you dig a hole in your backyard in your garden. But now put that at 9,000 feet and in minus 20 degrees. And every single shovelful of snow is like shovel. So getting those tents set up and dug out and prepared every night was quite a chore. But I wanted to show you this little video, and pardon my thumb up there, but it gives you a good flavor of what camp life is like. And I wanted to show you this video too, because this is one that Barney Swan took, and I think it gives you a really good sense of what it's the pace of the march and what it's really like. So imagine doing that 50 minutes on, 10 minutes off for 8 hours a day for 8 days straight. It was quite an adventure. It's also an adventure in your own mental abilities. I brought a book on tape. I listened to a couple of different books. One of my friends on the expedition, though, he didn't bring anything to listen to. Most people had music or something. He didn't bring anything to listen to. What he did is he spent his entire, every March, thinking about 1 year of his life, starting at age 18. And he spent 50 minutes trying to recall as many details as he could from every year of his life from 18 into his late 50s when he did the expedition. I thought that was pretty cool. So 8 days, this is what I saw. No flora, no fauna, no penguins. Everyone that's ever been to Antarctica on any kind of other, sort of expedition or tourist kind of thing always asks me, like, did you see penguins? Did you see whales? I'm like, I didn't see anything. There's literally nothing to see except flat, featureless ice. Some days it was more cloudy than others. No stars, of course, because it's 24 hours of daylight, which makes the navigation a real challenge because, you can use GPS, but as we talked about, the batteries don't really last long enough for you to operate a GPS to be able to use it for navigation. So you're literally using old-fashioned compasses like the one I showed you before. And all you can really do is pick out a little bit of ice, a little bit of a black spot out in the distance there that's like a little crevasse or a little sastrugi, they call these little ridges that are formed by the wind. Just pick one out that's on your compass line, ski to that, then pick one out that's on the next compass line and ski to that and keep going. But it's featureless terrain. One of the other big challenges for me, especially, I live in Chicago and I did one bit of training in Colorado, but I never really got a chance to do much high altitude training. I did take high altitude medication, but one of the biggest challenges was my breath control, because I was breathing very hard. And if you breathe hard, of course, you remember from those minus 23-degree days in Minnesota, your glasses get fogged up. Well, now my goggles, you have to have goggles on your face because you can't leave any part of your skin unprotected or it will get frostbitten. So my goggles would get frozen up and get iced over. And, like when you're skiing in the mountains or whatever, that'll warm back up in the lodge or it'll warm up on the way down. But here, all it does is turn to ice. So I fortunately had been advised by someone else to have 3 sets of goggles. So I had one on my face that was almost always frozen over, and I was looking out through a tiny little corner of the goggles that I could see on for most of the expedition. I had one in my armpit because that was warm, and I had one right down the front of my pants because it was another warm place, and it would just rotate those 3 goggles all day long. Camp life was, actually not all terrible. Our expedition made a decision at the beginning that I think was one of the best decisions we made, which is that we were going to bring an extra tent. And that just happened to be the one that I was carrying because I was too stupid to go slow on the shakedown cruise. But we took an extra tent, and every day we would dig out the tent here and create a little space so that everyone on the expedition could get together for 2 meals. So we got together for breakfast and for dinner every day. We would heat up our water there. You can see kind of the pot there. We'd melt snow to heat up water. Water would go into our dried food, and then we would all eat together and enjoy each other's company. And this is what really bonded us as an expedition. Otherwise, if you could think about it, you would really only get to know your tent mate on an expedition like this, because it's just too windy, too cold to really talk much outside. And you immediately are going to go into shelter once you stop. So this was a great way for all of us to bond. And everybody that's in this picture, I'm still very close with today. This is a great team and really fun to be around. You can see Katinka and Johanna there over here in the right corner. 2 of the expedition leaders who are, really some of the most amazing polar explorers that I've ever had the privilege of getting to know. Camp life also includes, of course, all the usual necessaries that we all have to do. But as I mentioned before, Antarctica is leave no trace. So everything that we ate everything that came out had to be bagged up and taken with us. And so, as you might imagine, in the tents at night, if you couldn't sleep, and had things to discuss, one of the things we would often discuss is which is heavier, the food we carried in our sledge or the crap that we carried in our sledge afterward. And it was quite funny, I think, maybe not so funny, but it was quite interesting to be taking out your little literally dog poop bags on the bottom of your sled at the South Pole and dumping them into a collection thing for their flight back to Chile so that they could be handled properly. But this is a picture of one of our expedition leaders digging ourselves a little privacy. He would make snow blocks of a little bit of privacy so you can sit on that 5-gallon bucket and do your thing every night. So on the 8th day, we started seeing in the distance in that one picture there, you can kind of see a black outline of it, this sort of black looking monolith thing, which is the Amundsen Scott Station. And you can see it from pretty far out. I want to say we could probably see it for almost a day of walking. It's this, this huge station, a huge monolith. On the 8th day, we started getting closer and I saw this sign, which I thought, frankly, was really insulting. You are almost at the South Pole. So seeing that sign, I guess, after getting over the sort of, oh, screw you kind of point of view of that sign, we took our little break and kept walking and reached the South Pole about midday in the 8th day of our expedition. Now, it's interesting because of course, the 24-hour daylight. The Amundsen Scott Station is supported out of New Zealand, the U.S. Amundsen Scott Station. So they just abide by New Zealand time. We were supported out of Punta Arenas, Chile, so we were on Chilean time. So it's daylight for us, but everyone in the Amundsen Scott Station is asleep. It's bedtime for them. So we never saw anyone around the station. We never encountered another human being while we were down there taking our glory shots at the South Pole. But here you can see us at the ceremonial pole, which is not the South Pole. The ceremonial pole is this little barber pole thing that with the flags of the countries that are signatories of the treaty, and it's about 100 yards from the real pole, but I think it makes for much better photographs. This is the actual South Pole. Not very exciting. It looks like one of those sort of roadside tourist historical marker kind of things. The shadows were wrong, but you can kind of see that metal pole behind the sign, and that's actually physically the South Pole of the Earth as measured by the staff at the Amundsen Scott Station. So this is me standing there, and the longer you stand there, the colder you get. So I literally got every layer and everything I had out of my kit and put it on. And as you can see, I had a giant parka, and I had then a vest over the parka, and everything I had around my neck, and it was quite cold. But we were there. We had made it to the South Pole in the shoes, walking the same footsteps that Amundsen and Scott had pioneered before us. It was a pretty cool moment. You can't go there without flying your University of Minnesota flag. So I brought mine, but this photo kind of makes it seem like I was there by myself with the Minnesota flag. But one of the things that these expeditions, they're very expensive. So to join an expedition, most people are sponsored. So this moment of standing at the South Pole and enjoying kind of our victory was also probably the coldest I was on the entire expedition, because everyone that's sponsored there is going to take a flag like I did. I just brought my Minnesota flag, but others had their corporate sponsors or their organizations that sponsored them. And so we spent over an hour standing around the pole, taking pictures of each other with all of our different banners and our sponsorships. I'm also a big watch fan, so of course I was very interested to kind of think about and decide which watch to wear on a South Pole expedition. So I took inspiration from Minnesotan Ralph Playstead, who wore an Omega Speedmaster to the South or to the North Pole on his expedition. But in his day, that was a vital piece of kit because they used celestial navigation, which requires precise time. So he used his Speedmaster and his sextant as ways of navigating. For me, it was just something to wear. But I wore that, the Speedmaster that I'm wearing today. I wore that watch on the South Pole. So I think felt like I was carrying on in a tradition set by a Minnesotan. This is the Amundsen Scott Station. As you can see, there's no one around. It's midnight for them. None of us have any idea why this tent was set up or what it was for. But we all thought that this Amundsen Scott Station was pretty cool. What you can't see here is it's built on stilts, but the ice accumulates every year. So eventually they'll have to raise the plane. It's designed to be raised on hydraulically. So eventually they'll have to raise the whole building because it'll get buried. And that's what happened. If you remember when we were much younger, there was a dome there that the US government had. And that's what happened. The dome eventually just got buried and they replaced it with this. We talked about the weather conditions a little bit, but these are some graphs that show you exactly what we faced. You know, minus 20 was a pretty good low for a pretty good range. You know, our average high was about minus 10. These minus 10 degree days were the first couple degrees, first couple days, which really kind of lulled us into, you know, this idea. And then the winds started coming up. So as you see, the temperature came up and towards Saturday and Sunday and Monday, the winds started coming up. And these Friday, Saturday through Monday were by far the most bone-chilling cold of the expedition. I wanted to point out a couple people that were really key in this expedition. Whoops, I'm sorry. This is my tent mate, Cameron Kerr. Cameron and I were kind of mated up, I guess, as tent mates because we were both Army officers. I was in the Army 30 years ago. Cameron was an Afghanistan veteran. But the thing that really makes Cameron remarkable, he's a remarkable guy in and of himself. But what makes him in this expedition remarkable is that Cameron had his leg blown off in Afghanistan. So he did this entire expedition, the one that I told you that was so hard for me that I had such a difficult challenge to do as an ordinary Midwesterner, father of three. Cameron did the same thing, but he did it on one real leg and one prosthetic leg. And his courage to see him put that leg on every morning, to go through endure the pain of getting that thing on, endure the cold of it, endure the sore muscles, endure the chafe that came around it, endure all of it is just so inspirational. On the very last day, Cameron's leg had swollen to the point where he couldn't get it in his prosthetic. And we had half a day left of skiing, but there was no way Cameron was going to give up. And I sat there from this exact view that I took that picture. I sat there and watched Cameron just with absolute sheer white pain on his face, putting his prosthetic leg back on, stumbling out of the tent, hooking up his sled. Cameron wouldn't let me take any of his stuff. He wouldn't let me pull his sled. He was bound and determined to rise up from losing his leg in Afghanistan for his recovery at Walter Reed Hospital to walk to the South Pole under his own power. And I can't say I've seen an act of courage any greater than Cameron's ever in my life. If you're interested, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the equipment that we carried. You saw the jacket that I wore, and I talked about how this jacket is really just light, and it's really designed to only be windproof. And the wind, because the wind is really the thing that will kill you. You know, you see like these ads of the Canada Goose and stuff where they talk about these giant parkas that everybody brings to the South Pole. When the reality is, if you're walking like this, that parka is way too warm. You have to wear something that's light, but you also have to plan for some base layers. So I want to show you a couple of those. The one that's the most interesting to me is another Norwegian innovation. And you can get these in the United States now. It's called Brynje. And if you can see it, it's wool, but it's see-through. It's almost like, you know, like a fishing net, which is weird to think that this is the warmest undergarment that you could wear. But the polar explorers have proved over and over that this is really the thing to do. And so this is my base layer, which frankly looks ridiculous when you're wearing it. But it's incredibly warm, and just funny how a little bit of wool in a size of a net can be so warm. And then my second layer was a Patagonia, I think this is called an R2. It's just another insulated layer. And I would wear that then with my ski jacket, and that's how I would ski. Just those 3 layers. But the minute you stop, that cold starts seeping in. So that's when the big parka comes out. Oops, that's when the big parka comes out. This is the largest, weighted, heaviest weight down parka I think that's available anywhere. It's incredibly warm. It's maybe not quite warm enough for standing there in minus 20 degrees and doing nothing, but it's too warm for skiing. So that parka was constantly on, off, on, off, on, off. And most people would throw it on the back of their sled, but then it would get full of ice. So I threw mine in the back of my backpack. The other thing that's interesting to point out is fur. So, I think that's Ian in that picture there. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. But most of my expedition mates didn't take the step of getting a fur for their coat or for their jacket. Fur is obviously very traditional for polar exploration. It's super expensive, so maybe that's a reason. But then there were several people that just had moral objections to having fur, which I deeply respect. I bought the biggest fur you could possibly buy and had it sewn onto my jacket because I did not want to take any risks of getting any problems. I had no problems. I had no frostbite whatsoever on the entire expedition. Everyone else without a fur had some amount of frostbite on their face, whether it was their nose or their cheeks or something like that. The fur, and this is an ancient practice, but what it does is it does stirs up the air to make the air move around your face a little bit, so that that little bit of movement of the air creates a tiny bit of warmth that is the difference between frostbite and not frostbite. You can see there from Ian, he's carrying what looks like, well, it's this. It looks like a kid's sled, and it kind of is. It's not much different from the toboggans that we all had as kids. It's just, this one says expedition. But they are actually built of a little bit more sturdy stuff and have lots of ropes for attaching things to, and a rope that's specially designed for a harness. And they're super light. So you're not, the last thing you want to do is carry something that's useless, right? So the less weight, the better. So, you see the real polar explorers and stuff that have these Kevlar fiber sleds and stuff like that. And that's what I thought we would have. I trained on this sled when I was here, but I thought back home, but I thought for sure we'd have these great things. But then when you get down to Antarctica, they're like, no, this is the best thing. Plastic sled. Throw your stuff on there. And yeah, it looks like a 12-year-old kid going out to a snow hill, but it's a really great piece of kit. The skis you can see behind me are regular cross-country skis. They're probably no different than the ones you'd see anywhere in Minnesota, with one exception. They're 3-pin skis. So these are the same kind of things that we would have used, in the 1950s or 1960s. But in Antarctica, they've standardized that. So by understanding, every country, every ski in the continent is 3-pin ski. That means that if anybody has to borrow a ski from anybody else at any time, everything is completely compatible. The boots we wore, as you can see, are pretty substantial, but they're 3-pin toes. Oh, sorry, your camera's over here. 3-pin toes. So again, this is compatible with any ski. But this boot, you'd think it's pretty warm. I mean, it's like super thick on the inside and whatever. You'd think that would be fine, but it really isn't. It's not sufficient to keep your toes warm. So what I did, and most people did, is we wore one thin layer of wool, one second thicker layer of wool, and then a third layer, which were Gore-Tex vapor barrier socks. So they were like almost like having a plastic bag around your feet, but that would hold it would hold the heat into your feet enough so that your toes wouldn't get any frostbite. And that really worked well for me. The biggest issue that most people had was blisters. And blisters are very painful in this environment. You can't fix them. You can't really treat them effectively. It's just too cold. The only time that your feet and your body and everything else gets a little bit warm is when you're in your sleeping bag at night. And your sleeping bag ends up being kind of your best friend, because not only does it keep you warm, it keeps all your stuff warm. So all those things that you might think that, are just ordinary things that you would carry around with you, your cell phone, your sunscreen, your toothbrush, your toothpaste, any of that, if you leave it in your tent overnight, it's going to be frozen as a rock. How about your water? Just to have fresh water, if you leave it outside, your water bottle will be full of ice within a few hours. So inside my sleeping bag every night was just this cacophony of stuff. Me and my phone and my camera and my GPS and my water bottle, my sunscreen, my toothpaste, all this stuff all jumbled up on the bottom of my sleeping bag. But every morning I'd get up and I'd have sunscreen that wasn't frozen, and I'd have socks that were decently warm, and I could start my day. So I wanted to kind of start to leave you with just the sheer beauty of it all. I mean, it's this empty, beautiful, peaceful, crazy place. And if you look at it like this, it sort of seems nice, but never forget that this continent wants you dead. And that it's just way, way, way too hostile for human habitation. So with that, I wanted to just say thank you for the chance to chat and open it up for any kind of questions you might have.
Well, and I'd like to introduce Melinda Soy, who's our course assistant. Melinda, did you see any questions that you'd want to start us off with?
I did. Thank you. What a great presentation, Rob. That was
Thanks.
fabulous. Such rich stories. A couple of things. So Anne asked in the chat, did you have to set up camp at the South Pole, or did you stay in the station?
Oh, this is a great question. Yeah. So let me stop. Well, no, I'll keep the share up. You're not allowed. If you're not affiliated with the US government, you're not allowed in the station, around the station, or anything else. There is a separate camp that's north there, about 2 or 3 kilometers north of the South Pole station. Well, everything is north of the South Pole, right? But that's just 2 or 3 kilometers away. That's a non-governmental organization camp. So any scientific research, any expeditions like ours, along the same time as ours, there was a charity expedition that was led by a bunch of British rugby players. And it was kind of funny. I don't know anything about British rugby, but when we got to the South Pole, or got to the base camp, there was just like, it was like people fangirling these guys, and it turned out they were all super famous British rugby players, but I didn't know that. So, but no, they have a little camp there, and you can go and warm up, and you could spend the night if you had to. But fortunately for us, the way that the weather worked, the logistics were such that we literally unloaded our poop, got our stuff on the plane, and took off. And we were back at the glacier camp, maybe 6 or 7 hours later.
Wow. Wow, that's great. Jean asks about kind of the cadence of the 50 minutes of walking and the 10-minute break. Like, how did they determine that was optimal? What kind of testing was done? And then do people vary it? And did you have to vary it given the different metabolisms across a diverse team?
Interesting question. Yeah. I mean, everyone had gone through a training program, and everyone had been pretty carefully vetted by either Johanna or Katinka, so that they knew what the people were capable of. And that's why Katinka kind of made most people come to Norway and spend a few days with her, because she just wanted to know what you were made of. So everyone had their physical abilities were pretty similar. So there was never anyone that kind of fell behind. In terms of the cadence, the march and stuff, I'm not sure. I think it's really just tradition. I think that idea of, especially given that the 10-minute break is really more focused on eating something and fixing equipment, because you just can't, if there's 15 people on an expedition, you just can't stop every time something breaks and fix it and wait for somebody, right? You have to do it in an organized way. So you have to just, if something's wrong, you just have to suck it up until that 10-minute break, and then that's your chance to fix it. And I think that's probably where it comes from. Otherwise, it'd be chaos. There'd be no way to do this efficiently.
That makes a lot of sense. A lot of sense. Thanks. Ingrid, speak up if I don't adequately relay the intent on your question. So Ingrid mentions about Everest, and sometimes people who aren't really prepared to climb pay to go to the summit. And, is there any of that going on in Antarctica and the South Pole? And
Yeah.
Associated with that was a cost question?
Interesting question. Yeah. So there've only been about 30,000 people that have ever been to the South Pole. But most of those have happened in the last 10 years. Because the government has their research stations there, but this whole idea of expeditioning like we did is pretty new, because in the age of GPS, in the age of air travel, and the age of satellite communications, it's much safer than it was when Rob Swan did it in the 1980s, or when Scott and Amundsen did it in the 19 teens. So it's much more common now. And you can definitely buy a tour from Antarctic Expeditions, the same company that supported us. You can definitely buy a tourist tour where they'll fly you down to the Union Glacier camp, exactly where I was, and then they'll put you in either a Basler or a Twin Otter, another type of airplane, and they'll fly you to the South Pole. You can get out, walk around, get back in the plane, and fly back to Argentina.
Wow.
So it's definitely possible. ALE has another camp, which we never got to see, which is supposedly their luxury camp that's very near Union Glacier. That, as legend has it, it was designed because Elon Musk wanted to take his family to Antarctica. So they built some sort of super luxe camp down by Union Glacier in the Ellsworth Mountains. That,
Wow.
But I never got to see that. But yeah, tourism is becoming much more of a thing. And there's you can do these last degrees. Occasionally they'll offer them just as a commercial venture. You know, it doesn't, not always as just like an expedition for a cause like mine was. You can do that. There's also people that will go and climb, I forget the name of it, but it's the highest peak in Antarctica. There are people that will come down to do skydiving. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's the marathoners. So the marathoners will come up to Union Glacier Camp and do that, however many circuits, around 10 kilometers they have to do that.
That's wild. That's extreme sports.
Right.
Lucy asked about books on tape and audiobooks. How did you make that happen? And I was wondering, as he spoke about that, how you kept the batteries. Like, you know, how'd you keep your charge to listen to your book?
I experimented. It's a great question. I experimented with lots of stuff. You know, just first assumption was that my iPhone would be fine like it normally is, right? But, you know, it totally wasn't. My phone died, you know, like I said, within 30 minutes or an hour, because I'd charge it up every night because I really wanted to use it for my camera. I didn't bring a separate camera, and other people did, and I wished I had. But I could take a few shots in the morning or a few shots in the evening but that was it. So really, you know, the battery issue was kind of a big deal. And sorry, what can you
yeah, about the audiobooks. Yeah, yeah. How did you manage the audiobooks then?
So what I did find was a little audiobook player, which is some goofy MP3 thing that I had to figure out, you know, moving files around and whatever. But it was really just like the size of one of these iPhone or iPod AirPod cases. It was about that size. And it was small enough that I could keep it in the pocket that was closest to my armpit. And then I wore wired headphones, and that worked. People that used their AirPods, you know, they lasted minutes. But that wired headphones, but oftentimes it was, you know, sometimes it was more of a hassle than it was worth, because you know, one's out and you can't get it back in, and you're certainly not going to take your hood off to put your earphone back in. And in my 10-minute break, that was the last priority, is getting my book right. You know, it's like I got many other priorities besides that. So I would think about half the time I had my audiobook going, and about half the time I didn't. I did finish Lonesome Dove though on the trip. It was
I was
one
just going to ask what your book
I hadn't read in a long time, and I don't know why I picked it, but it was a good book for the journey.
Good. Karen asked about was there an established trail? And then just if you could contrast about the inhospitability of the South Pole versus the North Pole.
So, wow, yeah, two interesting questions. There's sort of established routes, right, that are kind of from, you know, you point the compass from Union Glacier Camp to the South Pole, and that's basically the way everybody goes. But we didn't see any tracks of anyone else. We didn't see signs of anyone else, even though there was another expedition going on around the same time. And around the same time, too, there were some of these solo unsupported people. Now, this gets to be a big controversy in these records, right, where people say there's, you know, solo unsupported ski. One of the controversies is around, once you leave the South Pole, there's logistics trails. So they basically have tractors that come down the same logistics trail from McMurdo Station to get to the South Pole Station, and they'll it basically like pulling trains across the ice. And that's, you know, it's not like a road or anything, but it's just a trail that's pretty well worn down, and so it's kind of marked, and you know where to go, and you can follow the tracks of that. So some of these records have been invalidated because people use those trails and say, well, that's not unsupported, right? If you used a trail that was made by some giant snowcat, something like that. Now, the North Pole is a completely different subject, because the North Pole, first of all, it's not land, right? It's ice. And all of us at various times have discussed as a team whether we would want to do the North Pole together. And we've looked into it extensively, and the reality is it's just not possible right now. Climate change has melted the ice such that there hasn't been a successful expedition to the North Pole in multiple years now. And what will happen is that they'll get, you walk for a day and then the ice breaks up and melts and it drifts, and then you've lost 2 days of walking. So it's just really, I don't know when the last time anybody's tried it. As far as we've figured out, it's just, unless the weather turns out perfect and you super lucky, it's just really not feasible to walk the last degree to the North Pole anymore.
Fascinating. Thank you. A couple people have asked about the Latin quote that you have on the screen right now. Can you translate that and tell us about
sure. Find a way or make one. This has always been a phrase that's been valuable to me. My sister is on this call. She and I took Latin when we were in junior high school, and our Latin teacher, I think, was the first one to introduce me to that phrase, and it's always been something that meant a lot to me. Another, when it came back into my life, was another polar explorer, Admiral Peary, who New Englander, who supposedly was one of the first to get to the North Pole, although now that's disputed. When people look at the historical record, I got a chance to go to his house, which is out on an island in the ocean near Maine. And on his mantle was this phrase, "Inveniam viam aut faciam." And I remembered that from when we were in middle school or junior high school, and it just sort of resonated with me. So that's the kind of company motto, if you will, for any of the companies that I start.
Awesome. Well, speaking of your sister, Thea, the awesome OLLI South Dakota expert leader, says, hey, can you tell them about Rob's eyes, Rob Swan's eyes?
Oh, that's an interesting story. Thank you, Thea. So when Rob Swan and his first team did their first Footsteps of Scott expedition back in the 1980s, if you remember, that was the time when the ozone layer was deteriorating, right? Because chlorofluorocarbons and the chemicals that we were pumping into the atmosphere were causing this ozone hole. And the ozone hole, if you look at the maps of the ozone hole at that time, was particularly acute over Antarctica. So Rob was basically a brown-eyed guy. But then by spending he spent over a year in Antarctica in the total expedition. And during that year, he believes that that ozone layer that would otherwise protect us, that changed the coloration of his eyes. And now his eyes are this icy blue.
Wow.
I can go back and find a picture of Rob. But it's pretty interesting. Yeah, so that is all related to the ozone layer. And it's kind of good news now that the ozone layer is pretty much closed, right? We've kind of proven that we can change those chemicals and not put them into the atmosphere, and that problem is more or less gone away, which gives me great hope that we can do something about our climate.
Wow, look at the steely blue.
Isn't that crazy?
eyes.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it used to be brown.
That's incredible.
Yeah. It's like it's not as good of a picture, right? But you can see, like, in this picture of Rob and Barney. Yeah. Oh, I neglected to mention that Barney, Rob's son, was on our expedition as well. So he was on the South Pole, or the Energy Challenge expedition with Rob, and then he came back to do the last 300. And there's really a good footnote to the Rob Swan story too. So after the last 300, after Rob injured his hip, was COVID. So for several years, we were all stuck at home, and no one was allowed to go to Antarctica. There was no season that year in 2020. So in 2022, in December of 22, Rob was able to organize a final expedition called Undaunted, where Rob, as the undaunted man, they dropped him off where he broke his hip the last time. No word on what happened to the 5-gallon bucket. But they dropped him off where he was the last time, and he and a group, including his son Barney, successfully made the South Pole in January of 2023. Yeah, right.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. Fred had some questions about just food. Did anybody have problems? Did you have problems with low appetite? Were people always just kind of craving food at mealtime? You talked about 10,000, 12,000 calories you were exerting. Did you have to use any special high energy dense foods?
That's a really excellent question. And food was everyone's enemy because honestly, with that being that exhausted, you just were never hungry. But you absolutely needed the calories. So in those tents at night, when we were in our tent, and I can go back here, when we were all together, we would melt snow in that pot. There's a little stove underneath that thing. And then you can kind of see like in Barney's hands there that there's just dried meals, like the same kind of dried meals you'd see in REI. But the expedition leaders would always load them up with water because they were constantly trying to keep you hydrated, you know, and trying to remind you of hydration. I remember Katinka yelling at me one morning because, you know, like maybe this is too gross of a story, but you know, literally you're peeing in a bottle. So everybody can see what you did. And she yells at me like, that's too brown, Rob. You know, you've got you're dehydrated. And so they were constantly forced, you know, kind of like reminding you to stay hydrated when you don't want to. And one of the things they would do is put, you know, way overload these pretty gross reconstituted meals anyway, way overload them with water, with hot water. So you just be like this soupy mess. And it would take a while to eat, but it was fine because we were having a great time all being together in the tent. So that was kind of your main two meals. And I forget the total calorie counts of those things, but call it 5,000 or 6,000 calories between the two big meals that you would eat every day. And then when we got to Union Glacier Camp, there's almost like a 7-Eleven kind of thing where you just take whatever you want and get ready. And I didn't really have a plan. I just sort of relied on some of the experts. And a lot of the experts were telling me about things like salami. So I took a bunch of salami. I took a bunch of energy bars. And the one thing that nearly killed me was apricots, dried apricots, which I love dried apricots. But boy, I didn't realize, like, if you eat dried apricots all day, what that does to your system. And so Barney and I still joke around about it when we see each other that he had maybe similar apricots or whatever, but we literally were sprinting to that little 5-gallon bucket, pushing each other out of the way to see who could get there first after spending a day eating dried apricots.
Oh my goodness. I'm making a note to not include that on our next.
Don't include it. Every time I see him at a convenience store now, I'm like, oh God, no, I can't possibly.
I'm jumping around the questions a little bit, but Fred actually had a follow-up that seems related with this picture actually too. If a storm had come in, like, first of all, was that a real possibility? And second of all, like, how many days were you prepared to be able to survive in your tent?
That's a great question. So we had about, as I recall, we had about 12 or 13 days worth of food. And days, I guess, is kind of relative because if you're just stuck in camp, you don't need 10,000 calories, right? So you can kind of extend out. But I think we left with, like, call it 10 or 12 days worth of food. What we would do, you can see in the pictures, like the tents, they have a floor, but then what you do is once you stake them in, you pile snow around the outsides of them. But then if the weather's getting really bad, what you'll do is you'll actually just cut blocks out of the snow and then start piling up blocks, almost like an igloo, around the tents. So I had to train on this in Norway, and it's an enormous pain in the butt. It takes forever to make these little blocks and kind of set them out like bricks, like, you know, when you were kids making a snow fort, same idea. Fortunately, we never had to do it. We never had weather that was that severe that the tents couldn't keep up with. But that's basically the drill. If you are stuck in the weather and the planes can't come get you, all you can do is hunker down. So you just build the best snow fort you possibly can around your tent and hope for the best.
Awesome, thank you. Let's see. Glenn asked whether there were any crevices near the pole. Maybe you could talk just generally about crevices and avoiding them. And
yeah, it's a great question. It's what kills most polar explorers, right? Like there's famous pictures of that. Some of the famous accidents on the Scott expedition were crevasses. They're incredibly dangerous because you really can't see them, right? It might be just a thin layer of snow, but then it's it's covering a canyon that's 60, 70, 80 feet deep. So what we knew was, first of all, we had some very experienced people, right? Johanna, Katinka, Rob, these people are very experienced and kind of know what to look for. Secondly, the first person is skiing out a little bit farther ahead of the others, just to sort of like, in case there's something, so that not everybody gets in at the same time. And then the expedition guides carry with them like a rope kit and stuff, so that they had to extract people. But fortunately, we never ran into that. There were a few times when the snow felt very, very unstable under us. And but there was never a time that we were in any significant danger. But that's just sheer luck. I mean, people have that happen to them all the time.
Ben asks about the magnetic South Pole and its relation to the actual location.
Yeah, and I don't remember the exact distance from the magnetic South Pole. But the thing that's kind of nice about that Amundsen Scott station that they built is that once those two things, so the whole time you're operating on magnetic south, right? You're skiing to a magnetic south. But by the time that variation would start to matter, like if you were Amundsen or Scott, you'd need to be able to figure this out. But for us, we saw this giant black monolith for like a day. And so by the time, those two courses would have diverged, we could see the home stretch. And so we just skied to that big black thing off in the distance. But I tell you, it was probably a day and a half that we saw that big black thing off in the distance.
Wow.
And fortunately for us, we never had to worry about it.
Yeah. Glenn asked whether you had to self-isolate before the trip, maybe anything about illnesses or I don't know, I guess you didn't need vaccines for mosquitoes.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting. Like I haven't talked. I should talk to somebody that's been down there more recently than me about what they're doing now. Because think about December 2019. This is the morning before the COVID pandemic, right? So the only protection that I remember doing is that there was some sort of like chemical bath that you had to walk through with your shoes before you were able to get on the plane to Antarctica, and then when you got off the plane. I don't remember what that was, but it was just like a cookie sheet kind of thing of some sort of chemical that you had to step in and wait in it for a second and then go. But yeah, otherwise no precautions. Fortunately, none of us got sick. None of us made each other sick. So I think we were really lucky in that regard. But also like I don't know what kind of, like say, mosquitoes, like what kind of diseases get killed in minus 20-degree weather? Probably most of them.
Most of them, right?
Yeah.
Marion asks about post-trek recovery plan. Did you have to adjust your diet, your activity level? You mentioned being on medication for elevation, adjusting kind of back down to your normal elevation
That's a really
level.
interesting question too. And I wish you had asked me that question before I left, and I would have thought. Because after 13 months of some really hard training, I was kind of ready to not do that stuff anymore. And interestingly, I probably lost 10 pounds on this expedition from the time I left to the time I got back. And, like all of us were joking about, we have the best beach bodies of our lives, when we're at the South Pole where you can't make anything with them or do anything with them. But I just proceeded to do nothing really and gained that 10 pounds back. And then I gained another 10 pounds back. Just because my body wasn't operating at that same sort of level as it was. But that training is not sustainable. I'm 55 years old. I think I could probably do it again if I really wanted to, but you can't do that all the time. It's just too much. It's too hard on your body. So
Absolutely.
Finding that balance, if somebody figures that out, please let me know in the chat, because I've never really found that balance. It's always just like up and down.
People have been doing great about putting questions in the chat. Are there people who have questions that maybe aren't comfortable using the chat or aren't familiar with it that you want to go ahead and unmute or raise your hand?
Cost? What's the cost?
Kind of embarrassing to say, but an expedition like this, with all the logistics of airplanes, fuel, food, equipment, guides, permits, it was about $80,000 per person to do it. And I don't know, it's probably more now. I don't know what it is now. But like I said, most people were sponsored. So most people would raise money or they would have corporate sponsors. There's a lot of companies and individual people and stuff that are very interested in the cause and want more attention brought to the idea that this continent is at risk of what humans might do to it if we don't continue to protect it.
Awesome. Tom, maybe you want to chime in with a little more context on your question around, I think it's just kind of if something bad happens, like how often does something bad happen and what kind of plans are there for it, whether that's loss of life, injury, you mentioned Rob's
Yeah.
hip dislocation, break?
Yeah, the cool thing about the international cooperation in the South Pole is like, if you need help, everyone will help you, right? Every country, every nation, they're all going to help each other. Nobody cares where you're from or whatever. It's like, what do we need to do to rescue this person? There's lots of those stories of cool international cooperation, helping each other out. In our case, we had our main line of communication was a sat phone back to Union Glacier Camp. They could send an airplane to come get us, which is what they did for Rob, but it's completely weather dependent. So you have to have visual flight rules. So it has to be visibly able to see outside of the clouds to see where you're going in order for the airplanes to leave Union Glacier Camp. And there are many days when it's not like that. So there's also lots of stories of people just having to wait, waiting 5, 7, 10, 12 days. I read an article not too long ago about 2 Twin Otter pilots who had to land because of weather. And then they ended up sleeping in their airplane for like 16 or 18 days, waiting for another airplane to come get them. So you definitely have to be prepared. We had all the equipment we could possibly have. And I think if we needed to wait that long, we would have definitely started rationing food. Water is no problem at all because you just scoop up the snow and melt it. Fuel is your real problem because you need to melt that snow. You will not survive without melting the snow.
Awesome. Ingrid asks, she knows Thea's on the call. She might not know you have other family on the call also. And she's asking, how does your family feel about all of this? And were you able to be in contact with them during the expedition?
Gosh, we should let them pipe up on that.
Yeah, Dad, what do you have to, Mom, what do you have to say about that? If they don't log on here quick, I'll tell you, we have a satellite or Eros, they run the Landsat satellites here in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And I called one of my friends because we had a way that we could track Rob through at least part of his journey. And one day he just went off the map for me. And I called my friend at the satellite place. I'm like, why can't I find him? Where'd he go? What happened? And he said, he's like, well, do you want me to change the satellite so you can pick him up? And I said, well, yeah. And
Wow.
he started laughing. He's like, no. But basically he said at that time they had 0 satellites going over Antarctica, and I'd never be able to see him until he was back out. So
Wow.
yeah, we were nervous. I don't know if Mom and Dad have something to say.
Well, this is Mom and Dad.
Hi.
And
Wonderful, Rob.
Thanks,
no
Mom.
more trips, Rob.
Awesome.
It's interesting what you said too, Thea, about the satellite trackers, because there's Garmin makes something that's called an inReach that a lot of explorers take. I carry one in my airplane that it just uses satellite communications and short messages, and you can send a text kind of thing. But interestingly, the map that comes with that, it doesn't include Antarctica. And so we started like looking around, like no one has one. Because it's just, it's not a market. It's too small of a thing. So
Right.
yeah, you fall off the edge of the world. Maybe the world is flat. I don't know.
Could be.
That's
Yeah, we were
great.
pretty worried, but he's one of the strongest people I know, so we didn't have any doubt he'd be fine.
Awesome. Thanks, Thea. Rob, I did post a link to your interview that you shared with us at the very beginning of the call for folks. So the interview that Rob did with the University of Minnesota Alumni Group 6 months after the trip or so during COVID lockdown. So that link is posted in the chat for that. Jean asked about if Rob S. will try again. I think you said that he completed the
Yeah, and he did. And so Rob has, finished his personal mission to make that last expedition to the pole. And he's now, I believe, 65 or 66 years old. And he's just said he's going to spend the rest of his time advocating for the renewal of that treaty. And so I don't think he's got another expedition going. Barney, his son, is another fascinating guy, and he and I became close friends. What Barney's now doing is he's Australian by birth. And so Barney has moved back to Australia. He bought a cattle pasture and is reforesting it. It's in the middle of the Daintree rainforest there in North Queensland, where there was a lot of deforestation in the 1950s and 1960s. And in Australia has a carbon credit system, where if you're going to put out carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, you have to buy credits. And so the way that you buy credits is by planting trees. So Barney's reforesting this, and Amanda, my wife, and I got to go down there last year and spend some time with Barney, and we've helped him raise money and stuff. So it's a pretty cool cause. So he's very focused on that too. I don't think Barney has plans to do the polls again either.
Well, I just want to say what an absolutely fabulous session this was. It was really fascinating, and you are a great presenter. It's been great to hear your stories. Thank you. Is there anything else that you want to share with the group before we say goodbye?
Thanks. Thank you for the compliment, and really honestly, thank you for the opportunity to be here and to talk to all of you. You know, it's fun to be around a bunch of Minnesotans and South Dakotans again. But I guess I would just encourage you to, you know, just to remember that this treaty is important. That if Antarctica is 60% of the fresh water in the world, it's the only unspoiled land we have. It's an ancient place. You can drill down into the soil, into the snow, the ice in Antarctica, and find out what the atmosphere was like tens of millions of years ago. It's a remarkable place that is unlike anything else on Earth. And if we don't decide to save it, all we're going to do is exploit it for whatever minerals are available, and we'll ruin it forever. So I'd just like to ask everybody to, you know, keep that in mind as we head toward 2041.
Wonderful. Thank you. And with that, we'll close right on time. So
Great. Perfect.
great job. Thank you
Thanks.
very much.
Thanks for the opportunity,
Thank
everybody.
you.
All right. Thanks.